Before the rating boards got soft and Hollywood learned how to play it safe, there was a world where films dared to cross every boundary. Grindhouse wasn't about good taste, it was about no taste. These movies weren't trying to sneak by censors, they shoved chaos right in their faces. Have you ever wondered what films pushed so far that even underground theaters flinched? Well, strap in, because we're diving headfirst into the Grindhouse shockers that made censors sweat bullets. Blood Feast, 1963. Let's start with the film that made audiences not just uncomfortable, but physically sick. Herschel Gordon Lewis, forever dubbed the Godfather of Gore, unleashed Blood Feast, a no-budget thriller that rewrote the rules of horror. The premise was outrageous. An Egyptian caterer murders women and carves them up to prepare a ritualistic feast. On paper, it sounds absurd. On screen, it became one of the most shocking experiences of the 1960s. Lewis had only about $24,000 to work with, and it showed. The acting was wooden, the dialogue clunky, and the sets cheap. But none of that mattered. What people remembered, what censors feared, was the gore. No film before had dared to show it this directly. We're talking entrails spilled across tables, hacked limbs, and the infamous tongue removal scene that left 1963 audiences screaming, fainting, or bolting for the exit. The marketing leaned into the outrage. Drive-ins plastered posters boasting nothing so appalling in the history of motion pictures. They weren't exaggerating. It was practically a dare. Some theaters even handed out vomit bags as a gimmick, and plenty of patrons needed them. Censors hated every second. Critics called it trash. But Lewis knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't chasing prestige, he was chasing headlines. And he got them. The bright red, paint-like blood may look fake now, but to audiences raised on black and white crime dramas, it felt like cinema had crossed into forbidden territory. Blood Feast didn't just break rules, it invented an entire playbook. Slashers, splatter films, and gore-driven horror all trace their lineage back to this messy little movie. Love it or hate it, Lewis proved one thing: audiences would pay to be shocked. And from that moment forward, cinema never stopped bleeding. 2000 Maniacs. 1964. What do you get when you mix a Southern carnival, Confederate revenge fantasies, and Herschel Gordon Lewis at his most unhinged? You get 2000 Maniacs, a movie so wild it made censors want to pack up and go home. The setup is simple but sinister. A group of northern travelers are lured into a seemingly friendly southern town for a celebration. Except the locals are actually ghosts seeking brutal revenge for the Civil War. The killings are staged as twisted carnival games. Victims are rolled down a hill in a spiked barrel, crushed by a boulder, or torn apart in ways that make you question how this ever got filmed. Each scene is shot with the glee of a madman who knows audiences will both laugh and squirm. The gore effects were crude but stomach-churning for 1964, especially when mainstream Hollywood was still selling glossy musicals. What made 2000 Maniacs so controversial wasn't just the violence, it was the unapologetic nastiness. It played like a middle finger to polite storytelling, gleefully rewriting Southern history as a blood-soaked carnival. Critics tore it apart, but fans of Grindhouse lined up for the sheer audacity. Today, it stands as one of the first films to turn gore into spectacle. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't polite, but it sure got noticed. Night of the Living Dead, 1968. Yes, George Romero's Night of the Living Dead is now a classic, studied in film schools, and respected as a genre changer. But back in 1968, this thing was pure grindhouse shock, and censors couldn't handle it. Why? Because Romero didn't hold back. The zombies weren't just staggering extras, they ripped flesh from the bone. The violence was raw, and the black and white cinematography made it look disturbingly real. One infamous scene of a young girl devouring her parents left audiences speechless. Kids saw this at matinees because there was no rating system to stop them, and parents complained in droves, but that wasn't the only reason censors tried to bury it. Romero cast Dwayne Jones, a black actor, as the lead hero in 1968 America. He played the part with dignity and authority, only for the shocking ending to twist the knife. The combination of graphic horror and social commentary made the film feel dangerous. Drive-in owners loved it because word of mouth spread like wildfire. You've never seen anything like this. Mainstream Hollywood ignored Romero, but Grindhouse audiences made him a legend. Night of the Living Dead didn't just invent modern zombies, it showed that horror could be political, brutal, and unapologetically bleak. Censors could scowl all they wanted. The dead were already walking. I Drink Your Blood, 1970. If one movie captures the phrase too much, it's I drink your blood. Imagine a gang of devil-worshipping hippies terrorizing a small town, only to get rabies after eating meat tainted with infected blood. Yes, rabies. On LSD. It sounds insane because it is. Director David E. Durston leaned into every possible taboo, mixing cult hysteria with animalistic madness. What followed was a blood-soaked spiral of foaming mouths, machete attacks, and sheer chaos. Audiences had never seen anything like it. The Motion Picture Association tried to slap it with an X rating, which would have killed distribution. The producers fought back and created their own marketing strategy. No one under 17 admitted without parent. Basically, they turned censorship into a sales pitch. The gore was wild, but what made it worse for censors was the film's attitude. It didn't moralize. It didn't punish villains and reward heroes. It just unleashed lunacy. People were bitten, hacked, and driven mad while the camera lingered long enough to make you question if the filmmakers were laughing at the audience. For Grindhouse fans, I Drink Your Blood was perfect. It was unruly, unpredictable, and proudly offensive to every rule of polite cinema. For censors, it was a nightmare they couldn't contain. Today, it's remembered as one of the defining, you have to see it to believe it Grindhouse experiences. The Wizard of Gore, 1970. Few films captured the sleazy magic of Grindhouse like The Wizard of Gore. Imagine a stage magician performing tricks where assistants get sawed in half, skewered, or gutted. Now, imagine those tricks turning out to be real, with entrails spilling everywhere. That's the movie. Directed by Herschel Gordon Lewis, it starred Ray Sager as Montag the Magnificent, a magician who hypnotizes his audience into believing his gore illusions aren't real. The setup gave Lewis the perfect excuse to stage one shocking set piece after another, all while satirizing how audiences consume violence. Censors hated The Wizard of Gore because it blurred the line between illusion and reality. One moment you're watching a classic stage trick, the next you're staring at a disemboweled torso. It made audiences complicit, were they entertained or horrified. Of course, Lewis wasn't interested in subtlety. The blood looked like red paint, the acting was wooden, and the story barely held together. But that didn't matter. The film's raw audacity made it a Grindhouse classic. Quentin Tarantino even referenced it decades later in Juno and Grindhouse. At its core, The Wizard of Gore was a challenge. It asked, if violence was dressed up as a show, would you still cheer? Judging by its cult legacy, the answer was yes. much to the censor's disgust. The Last House on the Left, 1972. If Blood Feast opened the door, Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left kicked it off its hinges. This was Craven's debut, and it came with a tagline that's still infamous. To avoid fainting, keep repeating, it's only a movie. Only a movie. That wasn't just marketing, it was a warning. The story is grim. Two teenage girls are kidnapped by a sadistic gang, and what follows is prolonged torment that shocked every censor board. When the tables turn, the parents take justice into their own hands, delivering a finale that felt both cathartic and horrifying. Unlike most Grindhouse, this wasn't campy fun. It was raw, mean, and filmed like a documentary. What made it so controversial wasn't just the violence, but the tone. Craven made it ugly on purpose. The film cut from brutality to goofy comic relief, forcing audiences to feel whiplash. Many critics called it irresponsible. Some theaters banned it outright. Roger Ebert, however, defended it as one of the most powerful exploitation films ever made. For audiences, it was unforgettable. Some walked out. Others spread word of mouth like wildfire. Craven would later refine his craft with A Nightmare on Elm Street, but it all started here, in a grimy Grindhouse picture so intense that censors nearly buried it. The Last House on the Left proved that horror didn't need monsters to terrify us. People were enough. Cannibal Girls, 1973. Before he directed Ghostbusters, Ivan Reitman was serving up Grindhouse gore. Cannibal Girls tells the tale of a small-town couple who discover that the locals aren't exactly friendly. They're flesh-hungry women luring men to their doom. The premise sounds campy, and it is, but what set this film apart was its mix of comedy, gore, and sleaze. Starring a young Eugene Levy and Andrea Martin, the movie was promoted with a gimmick straight out of William Castle's playbook. Theaters used a warning bell to alert audiences when a particularly nasty scene was about to happen. That bell was supposed to give squeamish viewers a chance to look away, but really, it just guaranteed they'd peek. The gore effects were crude, but the gleeful nastiness sold it. This wasn't a polished horror film, it was raw Canadian exploitation aimed squarely at Grindhouse theaters in the U.S. Audiences ate it up, and censors weren't amused. Some theaters refused to book it because of the gimmick alone, calling it irresponsible. Others banned it after parents complained about its mix of humor and gore. Looking back, Cannibal Girls is more tongue-in-cheek than terrifying, but it shows how far filmmakers were willing to go to get noticed. And Reitman? He went from Grindhouse blood buckets to billion-dollar blockbusters. Talk about range. Don't Look in the Basement. 1973. Few titles scream Grindhouse like Don't Look in the Basement. Made for peanuts in Texas, this low-budget shocker takes place in a mental institution where the inmates have turned on the staff. What follows is chaos, murders, betrayals, and one disturbing twist after another. The film was directed by S.F. Brownrigg, and while it didn't have the polish of big-budget horror, it had atmosphere in spades. The asylum setting was claustrophobic, the lighting was harsh, and the acting was unpolished but unnerving. The result? A movie that felt grimy and unpredictable, like you'd stumbled into someone's fever dream. Censors despised it. Scenes of patients committing graphic acts of violence against authority figures were a red flag in the early 70s. Some countries banned it outright. In America, it became a late-night Grindhouse staple, the kind of movie you'd stumble into and regret or brag about later. What makes Don't Look in the Basement interesting is how it blurred lines. It wasn't a slasher, it wasn't supernatural, It was just people in an institution tearing each other apart. For Grindhouse audiences, that raw humanity was scarier than any monster. To censors, it was simply too disturbing to allow uncut. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre wasn't just another Grindhouse shocker, it was the shocker. Shot in suffocating Texas heat on a shoestring budget, this movie introduced audiences to Leatherface and his deranged family of cannibals. Everything about it felt wrong, dirty, and terrifyingly real. And that's exactly why censors didn't know what to do with it. Here's the thing. The film's reputation for gore is bigger than its reality. Hooper relied more on suggestion than splatter. The infamous meat hook scene? You never actually see penetration. But the camera angles, sound design, and relentless screaming tricked your brain into filling in the blanks. That psychological sleight of hand drove audiences mad and drove censors into overdrive. In Britain, it was banned for years, and in parts of the US, it was yanked mid-run after public complaints. Meanwhile, word of mouth spread like wildfire. People staggered out of theaters claiming they'd seen something almost too real, muttering about how it looked like found footage before that term even existed. The dinner scene alone became legend, claustrophobic, sweaty, and unbearable, like being trapped in a nightmare you couldn't escape. What Hooper proved was simple. You didn't need buckets of blood to horrify, you just needed atmosphere so suffocating it crawled under your skin. Censors thought they could cut it down. Instead, they turned it into one of the most profitable independent films of all time. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre didn't just change horror, it reshaped what audiences thought was possible on film. Elsa, Shewolf of the SS, 1975. If there's one Grindhouse film that even hardened veterans admitted went too far, it's Elsa, Shewolf of the SS. Made quickly on leftover sets from the sitcom Hogan's Heroes, it starred Diane Thorne as the cruel prison camp commandant Elsa. The movie leaned on sheer excess, graphic experiments, over-the-top violence, and a performance that turned villainy into spectacle. Censors were horrified. Whole countries banned it, while others demanded deep cuts. Critics wrote it off as obscene, dangerous, and exploitative trash. But in Grindhouse theaters, it became a sensation. Posters promised the most shocking film ever made, and audiences showed up to see if they could handle it. What made censors furious wasn't just the content, it was the tone. The film played everything with grotesque exaggeration, almost like a cartoon. Yet, instead of softening the horror, that exaggeration made it feel even more disturbing. It didn't wink at the audience, it dared them to keep watching. Against all odds, Elsa became an icon. Sequels followed, each more outrageous than the last, and Diane Thorne's character cemented herself as one of exploitation's most infamous figures. For censors, this was the line they thought audiences would never cross. But Grindhouse fans not only crossed it, they embraced it. Love it or loathe it, Elsa remains one of the ultimate shockers, and one the censors never forgave. Fight for Your Life, 1977. Some Grindhouse films shocked with gore, others with absurdity. Fight for Your Life shocked with pure, unfiltered rage. The story followed a black family held hostage by 3 convicts, subjected to hours of torment. What set it apart was its unflinching use of racial slurs and cruelty, delivered with a venom that made audiences squirm more than they cheered. Censors despised it, The dialogue alone was enough to spark bans in several countries. Critics called it inflammatory and exploitative. Even in the US, theaters dropped it after protests erupted outside screenings. But Grindhouse audiences? They knew controversy meant curiosity. Posters leaned into the chaos, bragging that it was too brutal for television. They weren't lying. Unlike campier titles, this film didn't wink at its audience. It was raw, ugly, and painfully straight-faced. Watching it wasn't fun. It was grueling. And yet, the finale flipped everything. When the family finally fought back, the release of tension was explosive, giving audiences a cathartic payoff they desperately needed. What endures isn't polish, it's intensity. Fight for Your Life wasn't stylish or clever, but it was unforgettable. It carved its place in Grindhouse lore precisely because censors tried so hard to bury it. They failed, and the film's reputation only grew stronger. The Hills Have Eyes, 1977. Wes Craven proved lightning could strike twice with The Hills Have Eyes. After Last House on the Left, he went bigger and meaner, dropping a wholesome family into the middle of the desert, then unleashing a clan of cannibals on them. The barren setting gave the film a unique terror. Sun-bleached hills and endless sand made escape impossible, and every scream echoed against empty skies. When violence came, it was shocking, especially the infamous trailer ambush. Critics called it depraved, unnecessary, even sadistic. Censors agreed, cutting or banning it in multiple regions. In Britain, it landed on the video nasty list years later, cementing its outlaw reputation. But Grindhouse audiences couldn't look away. The contrast between middle-class normalcy and feral brutality hit close to home. The family's fight for survival and eventual revenge turned into one of the most unsettling morality plays ever filmed. Who were the real savages by the end? The desert clan or the civilized family pushed too far? Craven thrived on those questions, and audiences embraced them, even as censors panicked. The Hills Have Eyes became another reminder that Grindhouse wasn't about comfort. It was about dragging you into places you didn't want to go and daring you to stay there. Blood-Sucking Freaks, 1976. If there was ever a Grindhouse film engineered to offend absolutely everyone, it was Blood-Sucking Freaks. Shot in New York, the story centers on Sardu, a twisted theater owner who stages grotesque, magic shows for paying crowds. The audience thinks they're watching illusion, but every act is real. With the help of his sadistic assistant Ralphus, Sardu kidnaps women and subjects them to increasingly deranged performances, turning torture into theater. What set Blood-Sucking Freaks apart wasn't just the subject matter, but the tone. Most exploitation films at least pretended to take horror seriously. This one smirked through it. Sardu delivers lines with a carnival barker's glee, while Ralphus gleefully assists in the madness. That dark humor made the film feel even more unsettling, like the director was daring audiences to laugh at the most depraved scenarios imaginable. The infamous human dartboard scene alone earned its place in Grindhouse legend. Censors despised it. Women's groups protested outside theaters calling for bans. Some cinemas pulled it after a single night. Even among Grindhouse audiences, it divided opinion, too extreme for some, hilariously outrageous for others. But controversy sells tickets, and that's exactly what happened. Midnight crowds showed up precisely because it was forbidden, daring their friends to sit through the whole thing. Over time, Blood-Sucking Freaks became less a movie than a whispered challenge. Too much for TV, too much for Hollywood, but perfect for Grindhouse became its calling card. The very qualities that made it reviled by censors cemented its cult status. Love it or hate it, Blood-Sucking Freaks wasn't just exploitation, it was a dare wrapped in celluloid. And for Grindhouse fans, that was irresistible. Rolling Thunder, 1977. Not every Grindhouse shocker wore its sleeves proudly. Some looked like serious movies, then blindsided audiences with unflinching brutality. Rolling Thunder was one of those. Written by Paul Schrader, who also penned Taxi Driver, and directed by John Flynn, it arrived disguised as a straight revenge thriller. But what unspooled on screen rattled both censors and audiences in ways few films dared. The story followed Major Charles Rain, a Vietnam vet returning home to small-town Texas after years in captivity. At first, it seemed like a somber drama about a broken soldier trying to rebuild his life. But the tone changed violently when a gang invaded his home, murdered his family, and mutilated his hand in a garbage disposal, an infamous scene so raw that even seasoned moviegoers recoiled. From that point on, the film descended into one of the decade's most uncompromising tales of revenge. Unlike typical exploitation fare, the violence wasn't cartoonish or played for spectacle. It was cold, methodical, and deeply unsettling. The killings carried a grim weight, making the audience feel complicit in the carnage rather than entertained by it. That realism was exactly what made censors nervous. Studios trimmed the film, and some argued it was simply too harsh for mainstream release. But Grindhouse theaters embraced it wholeheartedly. Here was a movie that delivered the grit and ferocity they thrived on, yet with the craftsmanship of a major drama. Word of mouth spread quickly, and in time, Rolling Thunder earned cult status. Quentin Tarantino later called it one of his all-time favorites, even naming his distribution company after it. Rolling Thunder proved that Grindhouse didn't need to be cheap or trashy to terrify censors. Sometimes, all it took was fearlessness, and a story too brutal to forget. Miss 45, 1981. Abel Ferrara's Ms. 45 sits high on the throne of exploitation cinema, a film that shocked censors yet carved itself into Grindhouse legend. Set against the gritty backdrop of early 80s New York, it told the story of Thana, a mute seamstress whose quiet existence is shattered when she is attacked. Pushed beyond her breaking point, she arms herself with a .45 pistol and begins stalking the city streets in silence. At first, her transformation feels empowering. Audiences cheered as she reclaimed control in a city crawling with predators. But as her vigilante spree continues, her sense of justice unravels. The line between punishing the guilty and lashing out at the innocent begins to blur. Ferrara never lets the audience feel comfortable, forcing them to ask whether Thana is still a victim fighting back, or if she has become something darker and more dangerous. The heart of the film lies in Zoe Lund's extraordinary performance. Without a single line of dialogue, she communicates terror, rage, and cold determination through her eyes and body language alone. Watching her evolve from fragile to fearsome is as mesmerizing as it is unsettling. And then there's the unforgettable finale, the Halloween party sequence. Dressed in a nun's habit, Thana unleashes a storm of vengeance in one of Grindhouse cinema's most iconic climaxes. Censors hated Miss 45. They called it inflammatory, irresponsible, and dangerous. Yet Grindhouse audiences embraced it with open arms, praising its raw honesty and disturbing power. It wasn't just another revenge flick. It was a film that blurred the line between exploitation and art. Decades later, Miss 45 still resonates. It remains haunting, provocative, and a brutal reminder that Grindhouse could shock while still delivering something deeper than anyone expected. So there you have it. 15 Grindhouse shockers that didn't just push buttons, they smashed the control panel. These weren't safe films. They weren't polished. They were dangerous, messy, and too raw for the censors who tried to keep them buried. But that's exactly why they endure. Which of these have you seen or maybe survived? Drop your pics in the comments, hit that subscribe button, and share this with a friend who thinks they can handle the wild side of cinema. The Grindhouse never died. It just moved into our memories.